Hello, this is Jack Burke, editor of Diesel and Gas Turbine Worldwide, and thank you for attending our microgrid webinar, Microgrids in an Uncertain Energy World, sponsored by MTU, a Rolls-Royce solution. Just a few housekeeping things before we get underway. After each speaker is finished, you'll have a chance to ask questions. At the bottom of your screen, you can see the Q&A tab. Just press on there and ask your question. Each speaker will be giving their presentation for 10 to 15 minutes, then we'll have some questions answered. And then if we have time at the end of the hour, we can go back to some of the questions we missed at first. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Cordelia Thielitz, Vice President, Business Development, Strategy and Product Management for Sustainable Solutions at Rolls-Royce Power Systems. Last year, the company established a microgrid competence center in Germany, a further evidence of the growing importance of distributed energy systems to the future of Rolls-Royce. Cordelia, would you mind taking over?
Great, happy to do so. So hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for the great welcome, Jack. And I'm sharing my screen right now, which I hope everyone is able to see. I am going in presentation mode, but in order not to lose any time, I really would say, let's get started. Well, the reason, I guess, why we are here today and why we speak so much about microgrids and why we see microgrids to come into play more and more is that we are surrounded by some significant trends, basically. So globalization, decarbonization, electrification, digitalization are just the buzzwords, but there's lots of honest things that are going on underneath those. So when we think about those trends, what we see also is there's rising costs of the conventional generation assets that we usually create our energy with. We see there is an aging of the grid infrastructure going on. And we definitely see that there's more and more also social pressure to create greener energy. So all of this basically paves the way for microgrids as decentralized solutions to come into play. The term microgrids actually has no real dictionary definition to it. So let me share our vision and our view of what microgrids actually are. So for us, microgrids are basically any kind of combination of renewable assets like from PV and wind that are typically covered with a battery and a control system to supply electricity, heat, cold, you name it, to any kind of load that needs to be satisfied. So any kind of consumer load that could stem from an industrial, commercial, government, residential consumer, whatever it takes. And as you all know, the sun is not always shining, the wind is not always blowing, so we need to have something in place that really enables to shift the energy that we can, in a very green and decarbonized fashion, generate from those assets, to shift it to the times of need, basically. And since this all has to happen, ideally below grid cost parity, in these days, to have a complete backing of a PV system, for instance, or a wind system with a battery would be too expensive. So for this reason, those days, most microgrids come with a genset, a diesel genset, or a gas system actually in support of supplying the last hours of the day. But in any case, this is already helping because of the battery being in the system. It already helps significantly to actually reduce the CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions that would otherwise be burned once we generate electricity from diesel and gas. What we see, and what you all may know, that in terms of batteries, we have power batteries, if I may call it this way, with lithium ion that are more set to provide to provide load basically for only a couple of minutes to a couple of hours. And there's other battery solutions like flow batteries and other types that even enable such decentralized solutions to provide electricity, green electricity, for many, many, many hours. And going forward, even taking the next steps, once we will be able to see the hydrogen infrastructure to kick in, to see more and more fuel cells, electrolyzers, etc., we will be able to step by step actually even replace this last mile, so to say, of CO2 and greenhouse gas emission sources, because then the gensets will basically be replaced with fuel cells, electrolyzers, etc., or hydrogen recip engines. So all of this is basically what we would understand under a microgrid solution or under a decentralized energy solution. This system here can actually work in a complete off-grid setting. This is where I think the microgrid idea sparked. So to put energy to places where in the past there was no electricity because there was simply no grid available. You can also put it to weak grids that we often also see, because in many areas, like India, for instance, is taking one example, Africa, there are grids, but the grids are not good, or there's lots of outages, burnouts, blackouts, etc. So in weak grid situation, but decentralized solutions of this type can also be in support of good grids actually, and help to strengthen the grid. They help to actually defer investments or grid upgrades that need to be done in order to support because of the electrification trends and phenomenon that we see, to support and defer investments and into the needed upgrades. The good news is that in comparison to the conventional incumbents that we have, generation through thermal power plants like coal and normal gas power plants, we see actually those costs are rising, and the cost for those microgrids are actually going down. And there's so much innovation that took place in the last years, basically, that were, and so much like mass manufacturing now of PV and wind, so much like R&D that went in that actually managed to get the costs down, which now also these systems and the penetration of those systems in the market is actually going forward and progressing, or were progressing, is still progressing, and quite big times. So, which is microgrids of this type are really actually becoming economically cost effective, which is really great. For us as Royce Power Systems, this is both actually a challenge and a super great opportunity, because we are in that field already, in the generation field, for more than 100 years, being these days primarily known for our recip engines, so diesel systems, gas systems, our fossil fuel based. And we are now really extending our portfolio to provide complete solutions for such microgrids. So we are expanding, we have batteries on board, we are working with fuel cells. We are, of course, augmenting our control system, because that is the key. And nothing works really, and I hope one step back, nothing works without a grid controller. It's like a microgrid controller that needs to be there in order to really make sure that all of those assets that are attached to it really work seamlessly, smooth, and that we have, with some intelligence and algorithms deployed, be able to drive basically also, especially the battery, to the technical fringes in order to make sure that there is no oversizing of the technology and that everything can be done as cost effective as possible. Let me jump on a couple of benefits that microgrids actually bring, because the good news is also that microgrids are expandable. They're really flexible. So as the load increases, you just add additional energy assets, additional PV, additional batteries. But what are exactly the benefits of those microgrids? So number one, that is apparently straightforward, talking about energy shifting. Because we have a battery in place, and here we see more and more also of longer discharge batteries to come into play, we really are able to basically harvest, for instance, energy from PV and then release it at a time when the sun is not shining. And that same effect can basically help to do peak shaving, for instance, in a commercial and industrial context, but also on a utility scale. It is really about the fact that grids usually don't like to see peaks. Peaks are often expensive. So what we can do with having such a decentralized solution, including a battery in place with a smart control system is to ease that, actually to make sure that everything runs really smoothly and that we shop off these peaks. What we see in a combination, for instance, of battery with gas systems, we really can, talking about spinning reserves and ramp rate control. So what we can do here is not just that we augment the operation of the gensets, make them flexible so that they can really be operated at the most efficient level, and thereby already reducing cost and fossil like diesel or gas usage. But we can actually also make sure that maintenance costs can be dropped down by just ramping and operating those assets much smoother. The same is true when we put it into a power plant context. We can help with batteries, for instance, there to smooth the ramping of those machines. And then voltage regulation, frequency regulation are more the corresponding to the ability of, for instance, batteries to be really fastly responding. So basically, batteries, different to normal thermal power plants, they can basically move as fast as the electrons, so to say, can fly, and this gives a huge benefit. And what we see is that also in most countries, the legislative framework, and of late, of course, because thanks to the Paris treaties, thanks, I think, also to now the Biden plan, thanks to what is happening, but that is of the things that are done for the European Commission, we see those decentralized energy solutions and any kind of decarbonized solution to be more and more supported also by the legislative framework. And talking about theoretical concepts, I would like to basically share some real briefly, some free examples on why those is not just talks, but why we also walk the talk. So for instance, let's go to the island of Indonesia, where basically it's a resort, the community there needs to be protected, the nature needs to be protected. We are basically ramping down diesel consumption by 55% because we put PV in combination with a battery. Basically, this is a really small system in this particular case, but it really helps to significantly decrease the diesel consumptions. Going same region, Asia Pacific, going basically to an Aboriginal village, Daly River in Australia and the Northern Territories, where most of these Aboriginal communities are powered by huge diesel machines. The idea is to reduce the diesel consumption there significantly. So adding basically some 2 megawatt in battery, 2 megawatt hours, 800 kilowatt, 2 megawatt hours batteries to the diesel. And of course, also adding PV is providing reliable electricity 24/7, reduces the diesel consumption by more than 55%. 50 was the target, 55 is what has been achieved. It's has a renewable share, as you can see, of 51%. It's really cost reducing. And the great thing is that really consecutively 10 hours a day, the diesels are not running. It's really only the last tiny bit that needs to be covered in order to make this cost effective, actually. And then there's another project that I briefly want to touch upon, Costa Rica. Here, the context is actually a commercial consumer that is tied to a grid that is also working really well. But the tariffs for peak demand are really high in Costa Rica for commercial applications. So in order, here we talk peak shaving, in order to get those costs down, PV plants were installed, coupled again with a battery storage. And because the peak tariffs are 4.5 times higher than normal tariffs, you can imagine the payback period of that project is just a little over 4 years. So it's actually a great commercial project. And in addition to that, even though Costa Rica is already a great country when we talk about renewable energies, but still during the dry season, when the water levels are low, they have to start their thermal power plants. So because they have because they have the PV and the battery here, they can even reduce the carbon footprint in these cases as well. So as I started out, I want to close the loop here basically by saying, so what I showed you here is basically microgrid 1.0 if you want, but going further and really making it even more effective and more renewable, we are going to add fuel cells, electrolyzers to the system. For instance, starting with also data centers to really go this last mile, and let's call it like microgrid 2.0, so to say, to make this really carbon neutral. In the interest of time and maybe possible questions, I think I'd like to cut it here, and I'm really happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cordelia. I appreciate that. Just looking at the questions. First one is, do you know how much the microgrid advantage is due to not losing so much along the long transmission lines? Has this been quantified?
I have no number that I could pull out because the microgrids that we have deployed are mostly and vastly behind the meter applications. And there, I think the numbers really range from a cut down of carbon emissions by 50% overall, like 30 to 55, depending on the case. And I think your question also was regards to cost or just carbon emissions.
Okay. Just a reminder to the people attending, if you have a question, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and just type it in there. I think one question that's come up is, and I think we've talked about this in the past, when you talk about microgrids and wind turbines and PV, that can tend to take up a bit of space. Is that an issue with some of the applications? I could imagine
we haven't really come across many so far. Of course, when you talk, for instance, about PV, often, especially in those commercial industrial contexts, is that often people would then like augment their rooftops, because not all rooftops, especially not in commercial or in industrial settings, are kind of made. So oftentimes the roofs have to be like improved, so to say, to carry the additional load. It may be an issue in very populated areas, and we probably have to find solutions for that, use space where available. But specifically right now, we have not encountered that. But I can imagine that this may be an issue depending on the location.
Okay. All right, here's another one. How do you see cybersecurity playing a role in the microgrid deployment? I think that's a good question given what's been going on in the world.
It's a good question, and I think it's going to be also a differentiator. Of course, we deploy a couple of cloud solutions that are supposedly safe, but you always have to be ahead of the queue and come up with good digital solution, actually with right measures actually to protect, because I think we all know what possibly may happen if anyone hacks into those systems and disconnects, especially when we talk data centers. Taking them kind of really off grid or making them completely like, no, not off grid, but like decarbonize them is an issue. So there are solutions in place. I think they're good today, but it's definitely a field of interest going forward to improve that further, especially when we talk more and more about like cloud solutions, monitoring, like remote interactions, because of intelligence that's of course also involved, and in order to operate the system even more in an optimized way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we have time for one more question before the next speaker. Let's see. In the examples you showed, what's the break even or payback between the incremental install costs versus diesel savings?
As I mentioned, for the example in Costa Rica, it's really 4 years and 3 months, I think, if I remember the calculation correctly. Usually it ranges between 5 to 8 years. It really depends on the case. It can also go to 10 years. It depends on how much own consumption you want to achieve. It is always, I think, a balance of having as much renewables as possible, but you don't want to oversize anything. So, and there it really depends on how you want to optimize it. If you want to optimize it for as green as possible, then your payback periods go way up. But if you find a good compromise to accept also still a certain portion of diesel or gas in the system, then usually find a good spot around 4 to 8 years.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Cordelia. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, everyone.
All right. Let's see if we can move over to Allan.
All right.
There's Allan. Allan Schurr is the Chief Commercial Officer of Enchanted Rock, a Houston, Texas-based company that delivers long-duration backup power using the cleanest technology available. Allan will talk about some of their projects, some of their successful projects, and some of the things they're working on.
Thank you, Jack. I hope everyone can see my screen. I'm not seeing the Zoom interface. Can you see it there, Jack?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And thank you, Cordelia, for a great setup on this topic of microgrids. I'm going to talk specifically about a dual purpose microgrid in the context of uncertain energy futures, which often is equated with the energy transition. And Cordelia, I think, highlighted a few of those points, but let me put a little bit of different structure to it because I'm going to focus on resiliency applications of microgrids. Resiliency applications that can provide continuous power in the same way that is so common today related to diesel backup generators. Resiliency microgrids provide that same level of capability when the grid is unavailable, but does so in a different way that can be much cleaner and less expensive than diesel and provide more flexibility for a variety of reasons. But let me just recap. The decarbonization movement is a lot about renewables, as we know, that's the headlines. It's also becoming more and more about power plant retirements. These are the fossil generators, coal, some nuclear even, that are retiring because of the increased proliferation of wind and solar on the grid and the economics that are resulting from that. It also includes electrification of transportation activities and even non-transportation activities. That level of decarbonization is a major factor all over the world, and clearly it's taken hold in pockets more concentrated than others. An example that I'll give in a little bit later highlights what some of that has been doing in our customer footprint. The second major thing that we're observing, expanding critical infrastructure means, pandemic aside, more and more businesses, even more and more consumers, find it unacceptable not to have continuous power. Data centers have been mentioned. Data centers are sort of the epitome of that, but so many other businesses experience significant cost, loss, customer dissatisfaction, penalties and fines when the power goes out. And that list is expanding as we have less and less tolerance for outages and more digital infrastructure. The final point I'll make is that severe weather has statistically, not just anecdotally, been increasing. We have many examples. Last year, there were 30 plus events in the United States that were over $2 billion of losses per event. It has been growing over time, and power outages as a consequence of severe weather have also been increasing. If you look at the number of outages that have impacted 50,000 customers or more, those have been increasing. And the nature of severe weather is that the outages tend to be longer, often stretching into days. And I would classify in severe weather also things that are happening in the west of the United States, public safety power shutoffs that are preemptive based on weather conditions, where they're preemptively curtailing power to customers to avoid igniting fires. Those three factors have a strong force behind each of them, and they are continuing to grow. What we see those creating is two separate interesting use cases for microgrids. The first one is an increased demand for grid stability services. These are the ancillary services and other services that a microgrid can provide back to the grid operator on a blue sky day that can help stabilize the intermittency of the grid, can provide peaking energy, frequency support, and other services so that the grid operator has more tools at their disposal in order to balance supply and demand in real time. That is growing substantially, and a lot of the types of assets that are providing those services today are in fact retiring. The other major use case has to do with local resiliency services. So there are many ways that microgrids can be used, but for local resiliency, that means at least 24 hours of backup power. Often much more than that is required by customers. Sometimes 48 hours, 96 hours, and often we see requirements stretching into 14 days, where the level of support during an extended grid outage needs to be able to provide the level of critical load and continuous power during that very extended time. We think a microgrid can provide both of those services effectively, and the way we go about providing that kind of a solution is a little bit unique on a financial and business model. Let me get into a little bit more detail there. First, for a moment, let's talk about, this is, I think, very similar to Cordelia's chart. The behind the meter microgrid here that can have a number of different energy assets. Solar is so common already in many parts of the country. It doesn't provide very much resiliency for a variety of reasons, mostly that the commercial and industrial customers have a hard time getting enough power, enough space for solar on their premises in most operations, and due to the fact, of course, that it's only operating during daylight hours. Storage coupled with that can provide some extended use and time shifting of that solar. But again, it's difficult to get enough solar, much less afford enough battery to be able to provide multiple days of continuous operations for most commercial and industrial organizations. Coupled with load control, but usually with a generator. And we have a natural gas-based generator that can also use directed biogas or renewable natural gas for a zero carbon solution. That constitutes the assets that are installed behind a meter and that can run indefinitely based on underground network of natural gas that can provide the fuel necessary to support continuous operations. And often it's an entire facility that can be supported, not just a portion of the loads. Our microgrid platform manages those assets and also can provide the level of grid stability services, pushing those services back to the utility, the grid operator, and being paid for those. So in our world, the dual purpose microgrid, the generation portion of it may only operate a few hundred hours a year. These are very high value hours. These are hours that the grid compensates very effectively for and can significantly underwrite the cost of the backup power capability when it's compared to a diesel backup generator that is so common around the country. Again, where solar and storage can be incrementally beneficial to those economics, that gets included in these distributed microgrids, but often they don't reduce the cost compared to a well-designed, properly sized natural gas or renewable natural gas-based generator. The customer receives the level of resiliency they're looking for. 5 nines is commonly talked about. What it really means for most customers, they don't want outages. And when an outage occurs, they want minimal disruption and be back in operation as quickly as possible. And with a grid synchronous interconnection to the grid, this microgrid can react quickly when there's an outage, or can even proactively island so as to protect from any kind of a power outage. And on return to utility service, there would be no blink at all. That really provides the cleanest way of getting power on a continuous basis and during emergency operations. Let me give a few example use cases. These are photos of our customers. These are a variety of industry types. They are the ones you'd suspect that have an interest in continuous power. So a healthcare facility in the upper left here, this is a picture of a 3.5 megawatt system. The question earlier about space required, that is difficult to get in many facilities. In fact, almost every facility we run into, it's difficult to have enough space to work with. That 3.5 megawatt system would be 2 strings of 4 generators each of the Enchanted Rock generator. So an 8-foot by 40-foot footprint. 2 of those strings is what would constitute an entire facility's backup for continuous operations. Working to the right, this is a university campus where there's 10.5 megawatts, 24 separate modular generators. These are Enchanted Rock's patented design, but 24 separate generators that can provide 10.5 megawatts to that campus. There's a variety of research activities. Research often has sensitive power needs, and research can be lost if there's a disruption in power. Continuing in a clockwise fashion, a retail grocery store, HEB, if you're not familiar with them, they're a very large Texas grocery operator. And this is a typical system that we install at HEBs. That's 3 generators, 1.3 megawatts of power. And this kind of a design, given the loads of an HEB, as is the case with most of our microgrids, we have an N+1 design so that if we're doing maintenance on any particular generator, we can still cover the entire load of the facility if there's an outage. And then finally, a water plant. This is over 12 megawatts of generation. The common element, as you clearly see, this is a single modular, single size generator, and it's designed so that we can add as many as are needed for use cases from less than a megawatt to 50 or more megawatts, all using the same technology. We provide the end-to-end service so that our customers don't have to worry about anything. And what I mean by that is they don't have to worry about the maintenance on this. We perform all the maintenance and inspections and things of that sort. We also provide all of the grid interface, decision-making and operations and settlement. We have a NOC that is monitoring both physical assets as well as grid conditions and the economics of those ancillary services, so that what we provide to our customers is a low-cost resiliency service that is lower than the price of owning and operating diesel generators that are much cleaner and a lot easier for them from a standpoint of functional support. Let me give an example where all of this comes together. As so many people know that during the Texas winter storm this year, Winter Storm Uri, the grid struggled because of extreme weather in maintaining supply and demand. There were large central station power plants that were shut in. They weren't winterized properly. Fuel was not available to all locations, and loads were at record levels. The cold was intense, to be sure, but there was also significant migration over the last few decades to more and more electric heating in Texas. And electric heating during very, very cold weather, as many people know, suddenly shoots up in its kW demand draw as resistance heaters kick in below certain temperatures. So the record demand during extreme cold conditions and a shortage of supply created rotating outages in the state of Texas that impacted millions of customers. And not every number has been counted, but there were hundreds of deaths as people were trying to warm themselves, and temperatures along the Gulf Coast that were down in single digits. Texans are just not used to that level of cold. Houses are not built for that level of cold, and heat missing because of the electricity being out created significant impact. We have over 200 microgrids operating in Texas, and I'll just give a rundown of a little bit how they operated, and then we'll get to some questions. The event was really an 8-day event, and I'll show you some numbers in a second, although the majority of the outages were occurring over 3 days. That's when the rotating outages occurred. About 2/3 of our company was involved in supporting these 200 microgrids in real time. 143 sites of those 200 actually would have experienced power outages. The longest one would have been 101 hours although because of the microgrids, we were able to support those 143 sites during that period of time. And as important to my comment about operations, when we were observing this weather pattern dropping into the state of Texas in real time, we were updating control software and pushing out patches to our generators so that they could operate in some non-design conditions successfully, and zero safety incidents during that period of time. Let me just give you a little bit more detail about how that 8-day period unfolded. These are 15-minute increments over that 8-day period, and the number of our 200 microgrids that were operating in backup mode at any given time. The first 4 days was when prices started spiking, and during those times, our microgrids were running, but not in outage mode. They were providing grid stability services to the grid operator and selling energy and responding to emergency conditions. Then the rotating outages began in day 5, and you can see the number of outages at any given time, around 80 to 90 at any given time, that we were in island mode, supporting those customers' full operation. And then as the power was restored, the last 2 days, prices were still high, and we continue to run. This is just an example of how dual purpose microgrids provide both grid stability services, paying for themselves, and can provide, therefore, very low cost resiliency that can operate multiple days of continuous operation. So with that, let me pause there and see if there are any questions.
Okay, Allan, thank you. That was very fascinating. Texas is noted for extremes in weather. I mean, you're going through a heat wave right now, and you had a winter storm not to be messed with.
It was only 4 months ago, and it seems like the temperature swung like 100 degrees. So
let me see. Okay, here's a question. Decarbonization will bring new business opportunities and new challenges such as cybersecurity. What will the approach be concerning weather anomalies like what happened in Texas this past winter, where grid deploys solar, wind, and fossil fuel generation? The grid was overloaded as they lost solar and wind power. You talked a little bit about that, but do you want to reiterate?
yeah, maybe I'll just add a little color to the Texas grid situation. There's about 28,000 megawatts of wind connected to the Texas grid, a peak of about 70,000, 72,000 megawatts. So almost a third, a little over a third of the grid is wind. Solar is smaller than wind, about 5,000 or 6,000 megawatts and growing. But during the Texas winter storm, there was a lot of cloud cover, and the solar wasn't able to produce. And most of the wind was available, but the wind wasn't blowing. So there wasn't very much wind energy. Those are the conditions, not a blue sky day, not a normal day, but those are the conditions where a resiliency microgrid can be incredibly important to provide resiliency services when there's outages, as the extreme weather indicated, but also services back to the grid operator. This week is literally another case, the opposite extreme, but very high temperatures in Texas, and the grid again was asking for resources in the ERCOT market, and resiliency microgrids, our dual purpose microgrids, were providing those services.
Yeah, one of our viewers pointed that out with ERCOT. This is specifically for Enchanted Rock. How does Enchanted Rock navigate grid interconnection agreements, which can be long and costly?
They certainly can. I think every utility is a little different in their process, and our experience working with utilities is when we start the process of interconnection, we go in with the same objectives that the utility has, which is safe operation of behind the meter equipment. And we've done enough of these where we have a good working relationship with local utilities, and many utilities are learning the best ways, the best practices of interconnection, and we're providing some of that guidance based on our experience with other utilities.
Okay. All right, I think we have time for one more. That's a little broad. Why not use fuel cells instead of natural gas generators?
So fuel cells are a good prime power application, continuous operation. They don't start fast enough generally to provide backup power, but even more importantly, they don't provide good transient response, meaning that if loads are varying significantly, starts and stops of motors particularly, fuel cells don't do a good job of handling that in large step changes. Diesel generators are excellent at that. There's an ISO standard 8528 that determines various performance levels, and G3 is the highest. With a properly designed natural gas generator, the Enchanted Rock generator does this, the G3 level, the highest level of typical commercial products, those can be met. So it's a fast start, less than 10 seconds. It can carry a very large step load changes and provide utility scale ramping up and down, utility quality power ramping up and down to match the loads.
Okay. Well, thank you, Allan. That was a very interesting discussion. And you certainly have your work cut out for you in the Texas market. Next up will be Scott Kessler. He is microgrid strategy and sales lead for Siemens in the United States. Siemens has been pioneering microgrid technology in the US over the past decade, including the work with the Blue Lake Rancheria in Northern California and the Commonwealth Edison Bronzeville microgrid in Chicago.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me, everyone. You guys see my screen right there?
Yes.
Perfect. So I wanted to come today and speak a little bit about microgrid controls. Cordelia and Allan did a really good job of sort of teeing up what microgrids are, the types of services they can provide. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the brains of the operation to a degree. The pieces that are doing the decision-making for the entire system that often can have very large impacts on the performance of a microgrid. Siemens, we do a lot in the space of microgrids. I particularly, work in our business that provides microgrid controls. Siemens could also provide an entire microgrid project. And in all these aspects, depending on which leaderboard you look at, Siemens is continually considered one of the highest providers in these services. Done over 76 clients globally and over 2 gigawatts in microgrid space. So we've got a lot of experience here, and this is not just limited to the US, but the US is by far the largest market for microgrids that we see. So what is a microgrid controller and why is it important? So the best way to think about a microgrid is that all of the individual components in a microgrid, whether that is the natural gas generators, the PV, the storage, what have you, all of those will have their own primary control system. And that is related to that device. It does, it sort of can receive commands, but it essentially tells, whichever DER you're talking to, it tells it what set points to hit. But most of those devices are really unable to think in a broader context. They struggle to sort of take into consideration, what other DERs might have, or take into considerations like market conditions and process all of that and do decision-making for the entire entity. And that is really what the microgrid controller is designed to do, is be that decision-making entity, both in regards to electrical considerations, but also in regards to commercial. Now, some of the key functionality that emerges from a microcontroller, you can see there on the right, I've bucketed into what I would sort of see the 3 main value propositions for microgrids. One being a cost savings economics. And here, a lot of the time, especially when you're looking at behind the meter microgrids, the focus can be on peak shaving, demand charge reduction, load shifting, actions that shave a lot of a customer's bill. And that's where you see a majority of the opportunity coming from some of these microgrids. But additionally, we are seeing, a very large demand for more market-facing activities. The ability to monitor an ISO or an RTO market and determine, when is the pricing fortuitous enough that you would want to discharge into the grid. Very similar to some of the use cases Allan was talking about in Enchanted Rock, where, you might monitor the ERCOT market and determine dispatch, on the best days of the year, where all of a sudden you're going to have very large price spikes. Additionally, we see a lot of, requests around resiliency and reliability. Obviously, that's one of almost the sole definition of a microgrid is the fact that it can island. And here you're going to need to be able to detect blackouts, so know when you've lost power. You're going to have to do a black start where you recover from the loss of that power. And sometimes, depending on the facility you're talking about, if you're a hospital or some other critical facility, you may need to do so in a way that is pretty much seamless or bumpless as much as possible. And the microgrid controls are very often involved in that, along with whatever the grid forming asset is, storage or a UPS or something like that. And then lastly, around sustainability, we're seeing more and more customers' demands here. And one interesting sort of use case that's come up recently is dispatch based on carbon emissions. So now we are having some customers who say, I want a microgrid, and sometimes I want to run it in a mode that prioritizes resiliency, but other times I really want to prioritize sustainability. So we had to design basically a new functionality for our controller that allows a user to dispatch based on carbon emissions. So they will compare the carbon content of their behind the meter assets with the carbon content of what's coming from the grid and make decisions using that as the primary motive. And it was a very interesting new type of use case that we'd seen. We haven't really seen many customers move towards that. But as you sort of hear big customers like Google and others, talk about the fact that RECs no longer really cut it, and they want to move towards a world where we're really doing 24/7 clean power, I think it's really interesting to see functionality like this start to pop up in microgrids. So what are the advantages of microgrid controller? One of the top ones that we see is transparency, the ability to sort of monitor the assets in a smarter way, in a more transparent way. For example, if your PV panels, all of a sudden get some dirt on them and their, production decreases, sometimes that may not be noticed, but it has a very large impact on a microgrid. And so a controller would make note of the fact that, okay, your production has dipped, the sun is still out, there's something going on here, you should investigate. So alarms and triggers, can be a very helpful thing when monitoring a microgrid. A second one here is optimizing value streams. So looking at, various opportunities to make money and determining what the best one is. You can imagine a microgrid may have to look at the energy markets. It may have to look at ancillary markets. It may have to look at behind the meter revenue streams and make a determination as to which of those is going to be most profitable at a given time. And so a microgrid controller is well positioned to sort of take a look at these various things, make a decision, and then tell the assets what to do as a result. When it comes to sort of making a determination, let's say we make a decision that we want to export power to the grid because, it's a storm and all of a sudden prices are peaking. Well, you have to make a decision as to which assets are going to do that. Your PV, you're probably automatically going to be using as much PV as possible. But when it comes to your gen sets, when it comes to your batteries, when it comes to, EVs that you might be able to throttle the loading till later, all of these things can be considered when you want to, maximize your revenue. And so you have to sort of have a controller that can look at all these assets and make decisions for all of them as a group. And then lastly, the controller is key to the islanding process, coordinating that both with a point of common coupling and any assets that would be used to actually do the black start. One sort of example I wanted to drill into just a little bit is optimizing that energy mix, because I think it's sort of a very good, it gives you a taste of, why, we hear the word optimization a lot, but, seeing it in examples, I think is most helpful. And so, what you can see here is the consumption of a microgrid facility. And now layered on top of that, you can see what the generation profile looks like. So obviously, there is a gap between the two. And so, typically what might happen is you meet as much of the load as you can through generation, and then, you sort of assume you'd have to pull the rest from the grid. But what you can do with a microgrid controller is look at, all of the options available to you and basically chart out what does some middle path look like potentially, where we might be able to increase the generation, whether that's through actually, running them at different ratings, or you could alter the way that those assets are going to be making decisions. Simultaneously, you can also look at the consumption side of the equation. So if you have controllable loads on the site, you can make decisions around, okay, do they all need to be running full tilt? Are there ways to shift energy? And so you can sort of see there's a more happy medium there where consumption and generation are much closer to each other. And essentially you're getting to a site that's much closer to net zero import, and there's likely to be significant cost savings as a result of that. So I just want to take a minute here and run through some examples where we sort of see controls playing a very big role. One project is the Blue Lake Rancheria project in Northern California. This was a Native American tribal reservation. Think of it like a fairly large campus behind the meter. They've got some residential facilities, commercial facilities, some water treatment facilities, and sort of the key draw is a casino and a hotel, which are sort of the main economic engines for it. Siemens was part of a microgrid that was deployed on the site that resulted in $200,000 savings per year. They're able to operate fully in island mode and with substantial carbon savings as a result. So I wanted to share with you all a story of what just happened during COVID, because I think it provides a really interesting example of where controls can play a large role. Now, one thing to know about this site is it's not allowed to export to the grid. Their agreement with their utility, PG&E, states that they can't export. And on the right there, on the top right, you can see what their generation profile looks like over a typical day. This is somewhat to be expected for a PV plus storage site, where you see that at night and in the early mornings, they are pulling energy from the grid, called interchange there. Then, the sun starts to come out. All of a sudden, you can see that the PV starts to represent a large piece of their load. And in the later afternoon, the PV starts to tail off and the battery begins to discharge in the late afternoon. So, why does the battery discharge in late afternoon? Well, you can see this in the bottom right there. The green boxes represent time of use pricing. And so you can see that the prices from about midnight to 9 a.m. are a little bit lower, then 9 a.m. to noon, a little bit higher, and then peak pricing occurs between noon and 6 p.m. So the battery is operating to take advantage of this. And so the battery charges at night and then discharges in the afternoon. But what happened during COVID? So, here you're looking at a site that had energy demands of about 525 kilowatts. During COVID, the hotel and the casino stopped operating. And so all of a sudden, your energy decreased significantly to somewhere around, let's say, 275 kilowatts. And so in a lot of times, microgrids might not be designed for a use case like this, because this facility, they never had plans to shut down their hotel or their casino. It's just not something they've ever done before. But during COVID, obviously, we all saw changes we never expected to see. So in a lot of situations, what might happen is you might either trip off the solar because the solar is variable, it's producing more than you need, and you don't know how to deal with it, or you might have accidentally exported to the grid. And in those instances, you could imagine that the whole microgrid would trip off because they are violating their agreement with PG&E. But our advanced controller sort of took a look at this new scenario, and it sort of said, okay, I have new inputs. And it ran, thousands of new modeled simulations to determine what the best outcome was. And all of a sudden, without any human interaction, it totally redesigned the optimization strategy here, where it started telling the battery to actually discharge at night so that there was sufficient capacity that the battery could charge itself in the afternoon when you have that large glut of solar and absorb all of that. And I just think it was like a really cool example of how controls play such a fundamental role for microgrids, because none of these assets, the battery, the solar, none of these would be able to make these decisions on their own. But the microgrid controller, as the sort of higher level thinking, was able to do this. One quick last example here, and then I will close out, is a project we're doing with Commonwealth Edison, a large utility in the Chicago area. And so what they are looking at here is a microgrid that is in front of the meter, and it's made up of two feeders on their grid. So on the first feeder, you can see in their phase one, they really just look to sort of island this individual feeder. And that was sort of, that was an innovative project in and of itself. But where Siemens got involved was in phase two, where they went from having a single feeder to having multiple feeders. And so they are looking at this microgrid as an aggregate microgrid, and they want to be able to operate it that either one of these feeders can act as a microgrid on its own, or they can act together as one larger microgrid. So think of it as almost a nested Russian doll approach to microgrids, where you can sort of separate them, or you can bring them together into one larger entity. And one last really cool piece to this is that we are working in coordination with the Illinois Institute of Technology, which has a microgrid next door. And the Illinois Institute of Technology microgrid will be pairing with the ComEd microgrid. And these two will be managed jointly by the Siemens controller, so that when one has excess generation or one has excess needs, load requirements, they can share energy with each other. And so all of a sudden it provides for a more sort of regional balancing approach to microgrids. And I think gives a pretty cool example of where microgrids may go in the future. So with that, I'll open up to questions. And again, thanks for having me.
Okay, Scott, thank you. That's fascinating. It seems like there's no end to how big a microgrid could be. All right, I'll look at some of the questions here. Oh, which technologies are still missing to deploy microgrids mainstream? Or is that question, does that reflect reality, do you think?
I would say it's not so much a question of technology. Most of the DERs out there, pretty good, get much cheaper. The controls, are already available. It's to really get to scale and adoption. In my opinion, it's a policy issue, it's a commercial issue. We need companies like Enchanted Rock that are going to be out there exploring new models. I think we need incentives for resiliency that are better than what they are today. I think there's a large value to be had from a grid or from a site that maintains power during an outage. Yet most of the time you get into a commercial discussion, that value is ignored. And so, there's a very sort of interesting question going on. It's like, what is the value of keeping a facility powered on? And I think we need to get a better answer to that question. I think that will provide a lot of the commercial incentive for microgrids.
Okay. What are the strategies to prevent a microgrid controller from being a single point of failure?
Redundant controllers is usually the best solution to that. You deploy multiple controllers and one picks up if the other drops off. And in most all instances, we've never had a problem using that.
Okay. One more question. I think this is more clarification about the hotel casino example. Was the change automatic, or did Siemens need to interfere to trigger the changes? It seems pretty clear that it did it itself.
Yep, automatic. Yep, all happened on its own. Now, some controllers, they need to get re-engineered for solutions like that. So it's just something to consider when designing a microgrid as to how adaptive you need it to be, how autonomous you need it to be. Smaller microgrids, less need, larger microgrids, more need.
Okay. Well, we're right about the hour mark, so I think we can wrap up this discussion. If I can figure out how to control my screen here. Can I ask you to
stop? Sure.
Yeah, there we go. Well, thank you, Scott. Oh, I want to thank all of our speakers, Cordelia Thielitz, Allan Schurr, and Scott Kessler for their time and expertise today. I think it was an interesting and a thoughtful discussion about microgrids. This webinar will be available recorded on our website if anyone wants to view it later. And I just want to thank everyone for attending and have a good day. Thank you.